Year 10 and 11, welcome to your video on comparing poems for AQA Power and Conflict Poetry. A quick recap of the poems in Power and Conflict are Ozymandias, London, The Prelude, My Last Duchess, The Charge of the Light Brigade, Exposure, Storm on the Island, Bayonet Charge, Remains, Poppies, War Photographer, Tissue, The Emigre, Kamikaze, Checking Out Me History. What potential themes could we be asked about? Naturally, we will be asked about power and conflict. I'm going to list some themes that I think might be asked about as well, or potentially asked about. So you have the power of the narrator, or the control of the narrator, or in some instances the loss of control of the narrator. If you are focusing on a question about a narrator, you have Ozymandias, My Last Duchess, Remains, War Photographer, and Checking Out Me History. Now, obviously, in a poem such as My Last Duchess, you have a narrator who is possessive and a controlling duke who controls the women in his life, i.e. by killing the Duchess and by finding someone new to marry. He uses the pronoun my to show he owns her. He speaks about her as an object. If you are looking at War Photographer, then you have a narrator who is tasked with the awful job of taking photographs within a war zone, and in one instance the narrator can be very detached and not show their emotions, but when they return home and they see the readers in the newspaper aren't particularly bothered, then the narrator does become involved. Checking Out My History, we know how angry the narrator and the poet is of that poem in terms of he feels that black history isn't taught properly. So when we're talking about power, control, narrator, those are the poems that I would pick out to compare, or what I think in that theme would be asked about. If you continue to watch this video, after I've gone through some themes, I show you how to answer the question, how to structure an answer, and I've got 2 questions to show you, and again, how I would answer them. A question related to war and conflict, then you have The Charge of the Light Brigade, about the 600 soldiers fighting the Russians. You have Bayonet Charge, you have Exposure. Exposure is a huge poem by Wilfred Owen about the danger of not only the weather, the enemy going insane, and you also have Kamikaze. So those are the poems that I would think would be connected to conflict within war. Yes, I know Remains is about a soldier returning from battle, so yes, you could consider that one as well. But I think Remains is more about the after effect of what's happened to him. If we consider emotions for a moment and emotional conflict and loss of power, you have Remains, as I've just said about. Obviously, he can't sleep when he comes home and he feels extremely guilty, and then they shoot the loot is in the bank and he's overcome by the experiences he's had. Poppies is extremely powerful. The mother who's lost her son and goes into his bedroom and then goes into the graveyard. War Photographer, I mentioned that earlier. Tissue, this isn't obviously associated with war, but this is the comparison of people to paper, and I suppose in that way the frailty and vulnerability of human life. And then Checking Out My History, as I said earlier, very angry speaker. Within this set of poems as well, we also have the power of nature, don't we? Especially with Storm on the Island and The Prelude, those 2 particularly. But again, Exposure would come in here because Wilfred Owen details the power of the weather and how the weather kills the soldiers. Storm on the Island, obviously we see the power of the storm, and in The Prelude we see how nature changes the narrator, and when he sees the mountain and the power of the mountain and what he witnesses. Apologies, I have missed the S out of Exposure. That is just a typing error. I do apologise. And to follow on from that, we also have place with London and the Emigre. Okay, obviously London when William Blake describes negatively the capital city of England, and the Emigre where she's torn between home and where she moves to. So let's look at a potential question. Compare the ways poets present ideas about power in Ozymandias and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. So we can see that we're going to be asked to compare. We are asked about the way the poet presents something. In this particular question, it is about power. The named poem is Ozymandias, and then you choose another poem. You won't have the anthology with you. You will get a copy of the named poem, so you would have Ozymandias in front of you. But for the other poem, you have to use your memory. So you really do need to revise the structure and language of these poems, because you're going to have to write about one that's not in front of you, and you're going to have to be able to quote. Okay? Compare the way poets present ideas about power in Ozymandias and in one other poem. Before we even compare, we do need a list of connectives to make sure that we are comparing, so it is very clear. You've got whereas, on the other hand, however, in contrast, unlike, alternatively. And if the poems are the same, you might use similarly, likewise, equally, as with, or in the same way. So don't forget that when we're comparing things, we must use the appropriate connectives. And another thing that should be part of our analysis is to always avoid shows. There's a lot of students use this shows. It becomes very repetitive and very monotonous. So here is some suggestions. You have got suggests, implies, outlines, highlights, describes, communicates, connotes, emphasizes, reveals, displays, establishes, portrays, represents, illustrates, informs, means, conveys, and symbolizes. So make sure that you don't always use the same word, so there's a nice variety there. In terms of essay format, I think you should introduction, right? Start with the introduction. Now, because we will be under strict time conditions, your introduction should be very quick. It should answer the question. There's no need to go on and on and on. Get in, answer the question straight away so you can move to the most important part, which is your analysis of structure and your analysis of language. Once you've got a quick introduction, you should then analyse the structure and the structural devices in the named poem. So for the question I just gave you, it's Ozymandias. Once you have done all of the structural devices in that poem, use a connective. Then do all of the structural devices in the next poem. That should be separate paragraphs. So you've got the introduction as your first paragraph. Paragraph 2 is structure in the named poem. Paragraph 3 is structure in the poem of your choice. Paragraph 4 is language and analysis of language in the named poem. So for us, Ozymandias. Paragraph 5, language in the poem of your choice. And then finally, if you've got time, a summing up in the conclusion. Now, one brief thing to say there is, depending on how fast and how much you write, you might want to divide the language paragraphs up as well, because some people will write a hell of a lot on language. So use your common sense and your ability to paragraph to decide when to change paragraphs there. So, okay? So if you remind yourself of the question about Ozymandias and power in Ozymandias, this, for instance, would be a very quick introduction, because that's all you need. Remember, structure and language is going to be very key, and your terminology and how you explain those devices. So, for instance, a quick introduction might read, in Ozymandias, Shelley presents power in two different ways. Firstly, that of a tyrannical leader, and secondly, through the power of time and nature. Whereas in My Last Duchess, power is presented through a possessive, controlling duke. So you quickly answer the question, and then we're going to move to where we're going to pick up our marks, which is analysing structure and language. So step 1 was the introduction, and step 2 is structure. So if we compare Ozymandias to My Last Duchess, you are going to be, in your structural paragraph on Ozymandias, you need to explain why there's a sonnet. Why does the poet use a sonnet? Why does the poet use iambic pentameter? Okay, and then talk about obviously the octave, the first 8 lines, and then the sestet, the second 6 lines, and the fact that there's a change of tone in there through the volta. And then the fact that it is one single stanza, but it does include a lot of punctuation. Okay, so that is what we're going to do for Ozymandias. So for instance, the first 8 lines of the poem present the problem of the statue and the fact that it is ruined and trunkless. And then the 6 lines after that, your sestet, gives us almost like a solution to the problem, if you like. And we hear about this King of Kings who had this land that he controlled. Then you're looking at your use of iambic pentameter and the fact that it's natural speech. And this natural speech provides us with a rhythm that emphasizes loneliness and emptiness, but more importantly, the passing of time. Okay, so through iambic pentameter, Shelley outlines how powerful time is, and that this powerful tyrannical leader, Ozymandias, the King of Kings, has been ruined by time, and nature has ruined the statue. Okay, instead of me analysing every single poem that we discuss here, if you go onto my YouTube channel, obviously Stacey Reay, Stacey, and Reay is Reay. There is analysis, an in-depth analysis of all 15 poems. And then in our paragraph on My Last Duchess, you are discussing again structure. This is a new paragraph from that of the structure in Ozymandias. And My Last Duchess is different, isn't it? Because you have got a dramatic monologue. Okay, you've got the dramatic monologue of, as I said earlier, the controlling duke. He reveals his thoughts. We have one huge stanza to show him the self-obsessiveness of him and how powerful and dominant he is, that no one else gets a word in edgeways. You have the heroic rhyming couplet, which again is this restrained tone. He controls women. He controls how he speaks. We also have enjambment. Now that is very similar to Ozymandias, okay, because where Ozymandias was like natural speech, My Last Duchess is as well. And he speaks and he's uninterrupted, and as he speaks we hear the frustration build up, which shows us how powerful he is and how he doesn't like what the Duchess was doing in terms of smiling at other men. And throughout the whole stanza is very punctuated, and it does show us that he's very calculating, that he manipulates the listener and he controls what he says, but more importantly, he controls what we hear. Okay, so remember, go onto my YouTube channel for all of this analysis. We have had a quick introduction which answers the question. We should have had our second paragraph, which was structure in the named poem Ozymandias, explaining all of the structural devices, what it shows us about power. Our third paragraph would be all of the structural devices in the poem of your choice. So for this one, I chose My Last Duchess, and again, what it shows us about power. So there's 3 paragraphs. Then we look to language. So our 4th paragraph will be language in the named poem Ozymandias. Now, we were asked about power. We must make sure that we are doing that, answering power. So, for instance, just a quick rundown, because I'm not analysing the poems here. You've got power in King of Kings, sneer of cold command, look on my works, and colossal. But remember what I said earlier is not only do we get the power of the ruler, Ozymandias, but we get the power of nature and time, and we see that nature has ruined the statue. And it actually shows us that nature and time have more power than him. We hear about the lifeless and survive and boundless and bare and stretch far away. We hear about how time has passed. Ozymandias is dead. His land is gone. It's been ruined. Okay. The poem finishes with that idea of boundless bay stretching far away. So we finish with this idea of emptiness. If we were to compare that to My Last Duchess, again, different paragraph, use your connective between. You've got the pronoun my, which shows us his control over the picture of his last Duchess, but also the Duchess when she was alive. We have the rhetorical questions that he presents as commands. Will it please you sit and look at her? That isn't a question, that's telling someone to sit and look. Throughout, we get this massive build-up of his jealousy, talking about how she smiles at other people and how he didn't like it. I gave commands. Short, simple line there to show us how powerful he is. And, if I give a command, people will respond. And the violence of it, we know. Even though he doesn't say it out loud, we know he's had her killed. And one of the most important language devices is the imagery of the statue at the end. Notice Neptune, though taming a seahorse, thought a rarity. So the statue itself of Neptune taming the seahorse is a parallel of him taming women. Okay, so again, we should have had our introduction, a paragraph on the structure in Ozymandias, a paragraph on the structure in the named the poem of your choice, which is My Last Duchess. A paragraph on language in Ozymandias. You judge how much you write there as to whether you need two. Then we need paragraph for the language in My Last Duchess. Again, if you need one or if you need two, you know how much and how fast you write. Make sure that every time you analyse a device, a structural device or a language device, it relates back to the question asked. In this instance, power. Now, I've gone through that very quickly. There obviously is more language devices in both of those poems. What I'm trying to do is just show you exactly what it would look like in terms of a comparison. So step 1 was the introduction, step 2, structure, step 3, language, and step 4, if you have time, is the conclusion. So the summing up of power in the two poems. Dead straightforward. Again, that should be much like the introduction, just very quick. You're not particularly going to pick up marks here, but I suppose it does show a rounded essay and an answering and an understanding of the question. So, just to reiterate the essay format, you've got the introduction, structure of the named poem, structure in the poem of your choice, language in the named poem, language in the poem of your choice, and the conclusion. Now let's look at one more question just to solidify what I've been saying about how to answer. So, compare the way poets present ideas about power and war in Exposure and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. So again, we're comparing. This time, power and war. The named poem, which would be in front of you in the exam, is Exposure, and then you choose a poem of your choice. Remember, you must revise these poems. So, as I said earlier, the introduction is step 1 and it answers the question quickly. For example, in Exposure, Owen bizarrely outlines the power of the weather and how this was just as deadly as the enemy, if not more so. Alternatively, in The Charge of the Light Brigade, Tennyson presents the poignant historical moment when 600 soldiers were severely outnumbered. As a reader, we see the power of a mistake within a war zone and the costly effect of such a blunder. So dead straightforward, dead quick, a quick comparison of the two with a connective. Nothing special. Answer the question and get ready to move to structure and language, which is where you're going to pick up your marks. Our next paragraph would be the structure in the named poem. So in this instance, it is Exposure. You would need to talk about the half rhyme and the strange line ends that Owen has decided to use and how that provides the poem with a very sombre, controlled finish. The regular stanzas and the fact that there's a very monotonous structure presented and that highlights the boredom of the soldiers, but the irony that they didn't realise the weather was killing them. And the power of the weather then is very subtle because they don't realise, do they, until later on in the poem. I think it might be stanza 6, but I might be wrong, what's happened. and what's happening to them. And repetition of nothing happens. I realise that some people would put repetition in language, but I think for this one it's a structural device because he repeats it, doesn't he? He repeats it at the end of stanzas on purpose, and it's part of structure. And it's this idea, as I say, that they aren't aware that they are dying, and that the weather is so very subtle but very powerful, more powerful than the enemy in this case. The charge of the Light Brigade has a lot more to say about structure, so again, you change your paragraph here. And it is totally different to exposure, so we would need one of our connectives on the other hand or whatnot. Now, for the charge of the Light Brigade, again, I'm not analysing it in depth because my video is on my YouTube channel, but you might mention the dimeter, the 2 stressed syllables, okay? And the idea that this falling rhythm is the devastating effect of the death of the British Brigade, okay? And in that instance, we have the power of the enemy. The power of the enemy, okay, is shown through that dimeter. Also the power of death, the fact that death is inevitable. Even if you're not in a war zone, death is inevitable. The numbered stanzas represent the 600 men. Now, and how powerless they are. It's the powerlessness of them, isn't it, really? And the fact that it's not many. That's not many men to send to battle. There is a similarity between exposure and the charge of the Light Brigade, and that is, again, the charge of the Light Brigade also sticks to this rigid structure to represent the military. Now, in this poem, they follow the strict instructions, don't they, which is what the stanzas represent. The fact that they follow strict instructions even when a mistake has been made, and even when they know they're heavily outnumbered and know they are facing death. And then other devices there, whether or not you would include them, is the fact that it's a ballad. I've put 3 L's in ballad. Sorry about that. Ballad. Sorry. And in media res. And in media res means that we begin in the middle of something, don't we? And in that way, it's the helplessness, and the reader feels just as helpless as the soldiers face their death. So after the introduction and our paragraphs on structure, we then obviously move to language. Now, actually, language within the 2 poems is quite similar. For exposure, we absolutely have to do personification, because when we're talking about the power of the weather, Owen personifies the weather. So there's a couple of examples, nothing over the top. Iced east winds that knive us, mad gusts tugging on the wire, flakes with lingering stealth come feeling for our faces, his frost will fasten on this mud and us. Again, you would analyse those in detail. Why are they personified? Why use a knife? Why is it stealth? Why is the weather given a capital H, his frost? Okay, so you would talk about the importance of personification here and what that shows us about power and weather. People always seem to miss out the title when they are discussing and analysing exposure as well, and you shouldn't, because exposure actually details the poem, the entirety of the poem, really. It is the exposure of the men to this harsh weather. It is the exposure of the men to the enemy. It is the exposure of the men to any mental conditions that they may be subject to because of the war. So don't forget the title. The title, Exposure, symbolises the idea that they are so vulnerable to the cold, to the rain, to the snow, and that this is killing them. And then another metaphor language device you could use is all their eyes are ice, and the fact that a lot of the men die through the conditions, not because the enemy is shooting at them, but the conditions that they experience. So the power in exposure is the weather, it is nature, it is the vulnerability of the men, and the sad idea that they don't realise that they are dying. Again, I'm not doing a full analysis of exposure. It is very, very long. I'm just picking out some ideas. You, if you need, can watch my poem on exposure on the YouTube channel. And then a paragraph on language in the charge of the Light Brigade. I've just picked out, again, some ideas. Similar to exposure is Valley of Death and Jaws of Death. So the power of the enemy, I suppose, in this instance, and the power of patriotism. Our men ran into death, if you like, to defend the country. So there's power on two different levels here. The power of the enemy, who severely outnumbered the British brigade, but also the power of the brigade to be loyal and to follow instruction and to attempt to win. Personification of the mouth of hell links to the valley of death and the jaws of death. Repetition of cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. I need not analyse that, it's straightforward. And then the emotive language of death and die. And as I said, how powerful the military is and how powerful it is to follow instructions and be loyal. Again, I'm not going to analyse all of these language devices because it's on the video, but I've just picked out some that you could do there. So just to reiterate, introduction answers the question, a paragraph on structure in the named poem, in this instance exposure, a paragraph on the poem of your choice, the Charge of the Light Brigade, language in exposure, language in the Charge of the Light Brigade, and then, as I said earlier, a quick summing up via the conclusion to show that you've understood the question and answered the question. If I just once again bring up this slide to show you a way of structuring your answer. Introduction, structure, language, and a conclusion. I would argue the conclusion is probably the least important because you're going to be picking up marks via your analysis of poetic devices. Don't forget that on the video I showed you connectives and how to avoid the word shows. I've listed some themes, not every theme, because it's the first year we're doing this exam and these poems, so I've just come up with some themes that I think you could be asked about. So just to repeat those: control, power, the narrator, conflict, war, emotions, emotional conflict, loss of power, the power of nature, place. Okay, so if this has been useful, or well, I hope this has been useful. If you need any of my videos, don't forget the YouTube channel has all of the poems analysed in detail. Stacey, Reay is what you need. There's a playlist on the AQA Poetry if you need any of those videos. Don't hesitate to pause and make notes. I apologise that I stutter all the time. I can't help it. Hope it's been useful. Listed some of the themes. How to structure our response. And good luck in your exam.